things are now. Now I'm just trying to keep all the people around me not congregating and separated. And we'll see. It's so interesting because it feels like you're over responding until it's done, and then you're probably under responded.
Which is a really interesting aspect of the resilience literature, right? Which is Eric's writing. Responding is one of the 4 pillars of resilience, and we seem to be able to. I mean, we're almost into the podcast.
Hey everybody, Reaction Podcast. Todd Conklin, I'm your host. Is that how I start these? How do I start these? This is the Pre-Accident Podcast. You've heard it a million times. So today's a pretty good one. Today I'm going to sit down and talk to my buddy, Sidney Dekker, Professor Dekker. You know him. And we're going to talk about COVID-19 and capacity and resilience. So that's what's coming on the podcast today. Before we get into it, though, how you doing? I mean, just want to check in. Some of you are working harder than you've ever worked before, and some of you are sitting home wondering what to do, and there's everybody in between there, and it's tough, and I worry about how you're doing, and I hope that you're keeping appropriate distance from other people, and you're washing your hands a bunch of times, and you're trying to stay out of the public, and you're not in groups of people. But if your job requires that you are in all of those things, how are you being careful and how you doing? Because right now, anxiety is crazy high, and fear is high, and scariness is high, and it seems to be quite a thing. I mean, just the economic impact of this pandemic, which is no small part of it, but that's just, it's devastating. I don't even know what to say. Other than it felt like it was a time to reach out to Sid and ask him what he was thinking. And we had a great conversation. Not all of it's on the podcast because we just talked about a ton of stuff. His university's pretty much empty. In fact, I think he comments that he walked across campus and did not see a student at all, no students at all, and that the cities are quiet and the roads are empty, and that people are really trying hard to not do things like travel or amass in groups or go out in public. And that's a real struggle. I mean, it's a struggle. And we start our conversation around that struggle, around the notion of, when's too much and when's not enough. In fact, the teaser for the intro for today's podcast sort of alluded to that. So you've heard it already. That is just one little tiny snippet of a conversation we had really around what's happening in the world and how it's all happening and what we're thinking about and what we're doing. And I can't tell you how much I'm thinking about you guys and all your workers that work for you and the position that they're in globally, because it's a big part of what we think about. And the idea that we have to just keep trudging forward is not just an idea, it's really what we must do. But by the time you hear this, the amplification of this disease in North America is remarkable. This week is a bad week. Next week, they're saying is even going to be worse. It's starting to have legs in Latin America. It's absolutely devastated Europe. You know that. Asia. It's amazing. It's a pandemic. I never thought we'd live in the example that they use when they talk about investing, that and this line on this chart is when there's a full pandemic. Don't worry about that. That'll never happen. Well, it's happening. We're in that line. We're in the worst case scenario, in the most uncertainty, in a truly variable situation, and we're counting solely and completely on our ability to adapt. That agility, that adaptation, that's what's keeping you alive. And that's what's keeping your organizations alive. And that's what's keeping people moving forward. And it's strange, too, because, geez, it's just the amount of disinformation versus information, how it doesn't feel serious. and yet it is serious. Those things are all really a part of risk. It's the part we talk about all the time, and now it's happening. And right now, today, it's serious, and it's vital that we stay hunkered down, but not single-minded, that we don't interact and yet we seek diversity, that we're very careful while being incredibly bold with our solutions. And those are really hard things to do because they seem like opposites, or they did until a couple weeks ago. Now it's kind of how adaptation works. So that's what the podcast will be about today. I think you'll listen to this more than once. I can almost guarantee you, it's really good. There's lots of information here, and you'll enjoy it. So let's start it. The best way to get on with this podcast is to get on with the podcast. So sit back and relax. You're going to hear Sidney, Dekker, and myself talking about the world, uncertainty, resilience, adaptation, and COVID-19. Thanks for being a part of the podcast. Tell somebody else to listen to this. Try to get one other person to listen, and we'll see if this really does make a difference. This is definitely the kind of podcast you want to play for the people who boss people around in your company. So here it comes. Here's the podcast. Let's talk to Professor Dekker, who's somebody who knows a lot about capacity and resilience and has been a friend of mine for 20 years. He's the person we ought to talk to. What are you thinking? What's up, Sid?
Well, part of what's up is keeping hunkered down is what's up. And so not just me, but the family. And I'm on the university campus right now, and there's a lot of students missing, man. In fact, I haven't seen a single one since I came to campus this morning.
Wow.
The classes are moving online, of course, and we're not unique in this. And in some sense, it's a minor problem compared to what others are facing. I still have a job, which is one thing, and still healthy. But the consequences are severe and deep, and I think it teaches us potentially a lot about the resilience or the lack thereof of the systems that we've built up.
What does that mean specifically? Because resilience is really easy to talk about theoretically, but it's much different when you're in the midst of this crisis that we're in. I mean, it seems like we're over-responding, but then in retrospect, it seems like we under-respond. Where do we go with this?
That's a very important point. As Eric Holnagel, of course, has written, responding between anticipating and monitoring and learning. Responding is a very important component of resilience. And you're right. I think you painted it beautifully that it seems as if we are over-responding by locking people down and not letting them leave their houses. And even those really drastic measures are then evidence of us under-responding in hindsight when it turns out that it really wasn't enough. One part of that seems to be a consistent underrating, and you see this in your own country, of the expertise that actually is available around these things. If you talk to epidemiologists, if you talk to people who do this for a living, virologists, they will tell you that these drastic measures not only are necessary, but would have been necessary quite a while ago already. Instead, there is unfortunately a level of politicization of the discussion, the conversation around this in your country more than any others that I've seen, which tends to not only muddle the message, but turn it into to crowd pleasing, into what is socially or politically acceptable, instead of driven by the expertise necessary to manage these sorts of things. So if you want to anticipate and monitor and then respond meaningfully, defer to the experts, right? So it doesn't help to then actually disband a committee in 2018 that was tasked in national security for dealing with these issues, for anticipating and monitoring pandemics. Right, so you disbanded 2 years ago. Well, you're sitting on the blisters of that right now,
and we feel it to an extent. But it's interesting in that the political side of this, the positive messaging, that seems to play an important role to the overall psyche of of a nation. So there must be a balance there somewhere, isn't there?
When it comes to leadership in situations like these, it is always quite tempting to turn to what seems to be strong and decisive leadership. And strong and decisive leadership in times of crisis is good, but if it is itself based on insufficient deference to expertise, to people actually who know what they're talking about vis-a-vis the nature of the crisis, then strong and decisive leadership can be very strong and decisive in a pretty wrong direction.
What about the need to oversimplify? I'm seeing that like all over, is we simplify very complex problems in order to make them palpable or manageable or understandable.
The major issue with the current crisis, Todd, is not just its complexity, and that certainly is interesting to reflect on, because contagion is, of course, a biological process, but actually it is much more, at least in our world, a social process, right? Contagion is social, and contagion doesn't happen if people don't meet, if people don't have social interactions. And so in order to track and predict and prevent contagion, we have to understand the social. And the social is by nature complex. But the other thing in this is that humanity, we have a seriously difficult time dealing with exponential functions. Right, that something is 2 today, and then it's going to be 4 tomorrow, right, and it's going to be 16 the day after tomorrow, right, and then it skyrockets up from there, and it's really difficult for us to match not only our understanding but our ability to respond to exponential functions in a way that stays ahead of that curve.
Which takes us to capacity. I mean, to me, that's the most interesting observation I'm seeing on a daily basis, is that we're really pushing capacity to its bloody, bloody edge.
There's been such a drive for efficiency in all kinds of industries, including healthcare. But we've seen it in airlines as well, right? Airlines touting themselves as the most efficient airline in the world. Well, you shave so much of your adaptive capacity when you do that, and the knowledge and the depth of expertise in your management layers, for example, that you have nothing to go with once this one hits the fan, right? And I think, well, before we go to capacities, let's briefly reflect on what that means for resilience. The two are, of course, deeply intertwined, but it is insufficient, and the literature and practical experience once again dictates that so clearly. It is insufficient to try to manage these sorts of things through a control of critical risks. It's not how it works, right? Because we may completely mispredict what critical risk actually is, or the size or rapidity of the escalation of that risk, as in this case. We've also seen that control of human behavior is incredibly difficult, right? We try to do this in all kinds of lockdown orders, and don't go to the park, and if you do, stay 1.5 meters from each other, all of that. But as we have known for years, right, control of human behavior, for example, through behavior-based safety, is dead in the water if you don't change the conditions under which that behavior emerges. And so, control of human behavior is not the answer either, right? It's in itself. Control of accidents, control of negative events doesn't really work either. Now, there's all kinds of ways in which, of course, people have thought about resilience, and I think there's one way that has come out of that that is especially instructive for the current situation, right? If people think about resilience sometimes, and this of course also comes out of the sense of high reliability organizations or high reliability theory, that reliable components are good enough to have a safe, good system that can manage a crisis or a situation like the current one. That if we have healthy people that don't interact, we're all good. But that turns out to be not manageable, and because we don't have all healthy people, and we cannot not interact because we're social beings and we need stuff from each other. And so then people say, well, okay, let's make it robust, which is sort of the next level up. Now that often gets equated in engineering terms with redundancy, right? If you have two of the same things, then if one fails, then at least you still have another one that can do the same job. And right, so you can get really reliable components, that is with a mean time between failures that is really long, to speak in engineering terms. But you get two of those, it gets even better. The problem is that doesn't work with people because there's this social redundancy that is really a fallacy. It doesn't work with social systems. People are not engineered components. They rely on each other for insights, for knowledge. They make assumptions about what the other knows, about what the other has or doesn't have, and which may or may not be true. Engineered systems don't do that about that. So I'm flying the 737, right? And the one engine is really not thinking about the other engine. It is, in fact, ignorant about the fact that there is another engine. And even that is anthropomorphizing the engine, which is bizarre, right? So it's not a sentient, knowing being. But if you got two people, they actually do know about each other. And so social redundancy really doesn't work in the same way as engineered redundancy. And you see this in groupthink, right? You get more people saying the same thing and you do even stupider things, right? So because we all seem to agree. So yeah, Bay of Pigs sounds like a really good idea, right? And so so social, anyway, I think I made the point. Now, so that's where people start thinking about resilience. And initially, right, even if you have reliable components and you make them robust and redundant, that still doesn't mean that if you push that to the edge of its safe operating envelope, pretty much the teetering edge where many hospitals are right now, then the idea of resilience originally was, can the system cope with that without crumbling? Back to its original functioning. And resilience in that sense gets measured as a return time to equilibrium. It gets equated with a rebound from trauma, right? That you expose a system to significant trauma and pressure, and the leaner you've made it, the more likely it is to crumble at the edge of its envelope. And so that's resilience if the crumbling doesn't happen. Now, what we've seen though is that is not really a sufficient or necessarily useful way to think about resilience in the current situation. Instead, can you somehow expand your base adaptive capacity to handle more unknown disruptions? That is the resilience we need to be looking for right now. Can you expand your base adaptive capacity, as Dave Woods would say, right, to handle more unknown disruptions? What we really need to get our heads around is, if you want to manage with a focus on resilience, you have to control adaptive capacity. Now, that's a bit of a contradiction in terms, because adaptive capacity is by its very nature something emergent, something dynamic, something that deals with complexity, and thus is not something you can control. Because if we could control complexity, then it wouldn't be complexity. It would be merely complicated or simple, right? Complexity is fundamentally in itself uncontrollable. We can do some things. We can influence it, for sure. In fact, everything we do does influence the complex system, but controlling it is very difficult. But that doesn't mean that we cannot control adaptive capacity. Let me take you back to a really cool study that many of your listeners may have heard me talk about or have seen the writing around, but it was in a hospital way back, about 15 years ago. And this is actually a pretty safe hospital. They only killed or maimed or injured 1 in 13 of their patients, right? Which is pretty good for a hospital. And so in the process of giving them care, right? And of course, the hospital was really interested in finding out what they could do about that and make that number even lower, right? Instead of 7%, let's make it even lower. Now, it turned out that telling people to not violate or to follow guidelines or putting up posters to be, more angelic in your, performance as a clinician, none of that worked, which wouldn't surprise anybody who's done this for a living, and it didn't surprise us either. But we then asked the Eric Holnagel question, which is, well, why do the other 12 actually go right? And it turned out, so we went into this and dug through the data. And what we found was that the 12 go right. So, sorry, let me go back. Asking why the 1 goes wrong is actually not as revealing and as interesting as asking why the 12 go right. What we found was that the 12 go right because those teams that make things go well have greater diversity of opinion and an ability to dissent. And when it's about diversity of opinion, you go, well, diversity is always good when it comes to complexity and resilience. And you see that in ecological systems, right? The greater the ecological diversity, the more resilient the natural system is. And this goes for human and social systems as well. So greater diversity of opinion matters. Now, what we figured, though, and that turned out to be the case, is that diversity of socio-ethnic background matters a little bit. Diversity of gender matters a little bit. But what matters most is diversity of professional background in these situations, that people have different ways of slicing the problem. People have different ways of coming at the problem and seeing solution pathways or, in fact, error traps that others with a different background may not see. The other capacity that we found in these teams that made things go well was their ability to keep a discussion about risk alive, even when everything looked hunky-dory. And so that is that sort of anticipation that Eric talks about, right? How do these teams anticipate? Well, you brief. You go, well, we've done it 5 times already. Yeah, it doesn't matter, right? Because taking past success as a guarantee that it will go right this time again in a dynamic, stupid thing to do. The dynamic, complex world is that past results are no guarantee for future success. And so teams that didn't take that for granted were those who were more likely to make things go well. Of course, we found the ability to say stop in the face of acute pressures to continue, an important component, and that won't surprise many people who work in safety critical industries. But really critically, and that goes back to a previous discussion, is we found the deference to expertise to be key. If you ask those who know instead of those who are in charge, you probably get better answers and better outcomes. And we saw that confirmed in this research. So ask the people who know, not the people who are in charge. And those are not necessarily the same people. In fact, they're often not the same people. And so now, that's, of course, not a new finding either. I mean, the high reliability crowd, right? The Northern Californians came up with this back in the 1970s, right? Deference to expertise. Let decision-making gravitate to expertise, and then you become an HRO or high reliability organization. It was one of the key components of the key aspects or attributes of what became high reliability theory. So deference to expertise. And of course, Deming, quality guru Deming was talking about this in the 70s and 80s as well. So it's a recurring finding, and we seem to not heed it, which is unfortunate. Teams that didn't wait for inspections and audits for things to improve, that sort of capacity, they themselves improved and intervened in ways that made good outcomes more likely without somebody telling them from the outside. Those are teams that are more likely to be successful. And pride of workmanship was another factor we found. Teams that are really proud of the work they've done, they look back on it and go, wow, that's a good job. That sort of capacity helps steer outcomes toward success. Now, again, and Deming found that way back in the 1980s as well. So it was nice for that to be reproduced. Now, if we go back to the idea of a control of adaptive capacity and you look at those findings, and if you're an accountable manager or a company board or a hospital board, you go, wow, if that's the case, if those are the capacities that make the difference between failure and success, then what is within my power? What is within my control to increase those adaptive capacities? I am convinced, Todd, that if you find ways to harness those and to leverage those, to even perhaps find more adaptive capacities within your teams, and you seek a sense of control over those, then you will reign supreme. You will come out of this good. In contrast to those who are just trying to manage or control the critical risks or control human behavior or control accidents or contacts or incidents, those are going to be behind the curve. If you want to be ahead of the curve, and if you want to be able to accelerate out of this thing ahead of the pack, make sure that you have found ways to control your adaptive capacity.
How do you do that during a sense of urgency? Because I think the sense of urgency is a new layer on top of this discussion that's pretty global urgency, big urgency, that makes this really interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And again, I mean, back to the work of Eric, he talked about scrambled control, right? And it seems that that's the mode that we're in which you are always behind the facts, that in which you are your interpretations never keep up with the way the complex situation is rapidly evolving, and thus your ability to respond, let alone anticipate or learn, is severely undermined. The only way to do that, though, I think, in answer to your question, is to make sure that within your own team, if you manage or run things, is to make sure that you have capacity in your team to focus on the slightly longer game and to focus on the adaptive capacity within your people, your group, your organization, to keep meeting emerging demands, highly variable, highly unpredictable demands. If all you do is scrambling around in emergency mode, you're not going to get ahead of this.
How do you feel right now?
It's interesting, as in science we try to decouple ourselves from the phenomena we study, right? That's sort of the idea or the ideal of the objective scientific mindset. But we're all part of this complex system. We're in the film, we're in the movie as it's being made, and we are actors ourselves as well. And in fact, we are stakeholders. I have kids in various countries, right? And so that sounded wrong. Sorry, my kids have moved out of that. Some of my kids have moved out of the house.
Yeah, that's way better than sounding
way
like
better.
I did.
I did sound wrong. So there is a personal concern around these things. On the other hand, I see huge opportunities, right, in various ways, in various levels. One is, of course, it's a study of resilience and brittleness in the making. Right, and that can tell us a lot about ourselves in the future, which we should be capitalizing on. Something that gives me hope is that we are forced to actually cut through and remove some of the non-essential encrustations that we've put around organizations, right? In our desire to manage risk over the past, say, 20 years, and the relative fat of economic progress since the crisis of 2008, what we've seen is that organizations have indeed encrusted themselves in all kinds of rules that probably turn out to be rather trivial or unnecessary or just liability managing rather than creating safety competence or resilience on the front line. You see that some of this now goes out the window because we have an emergency, right? There is a crisis. There's stuff to do. And so we take final year med students out of college and put them to work, right? We call pensioners in and say, here, you go do this. You have some experience as a nurse. Boom, we need you, right? And in fact, I just got an email from the aviation regulator in Aussie, where I currently am, and it basically says, hey, look, if your medical expires, don't worry about it. You're good for the next 6 months. In other words, right, you can just fly without a current medical. And so all of a sudden we're removing some of these encrustations that turn out not to be critical at all. Yeah, we were running around going, oh, my God, we got all these critical risks, right? Oh, imagine somebody flying without a current medical. They'll die. No, they don't. And it's under the pressure of this sort of crisis that allows us to get rid of that. Now, I think if we do that well, we will be able to accelerate out of this crisis quicker because we will be more nimble. All right. We've shed some of the loads that we have accrued over the past 12, 13 years without really much return on that investment because we were so concerned about managing the critical risks.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, it's so interesting to watch them throw rules aside in the time of crisis. I mean, rules clearly get in the way of actually doing the work.
Yeah. And it's interesting that if times are not crisis, we're able to hide that because rules always get in the way of doing that work. But we're able to hide it. We're able to work around it. We're able to sort of fudge it or massage it or not talk about it or, it's not really an injury. Let's not report it. Was it reportable? No, we didn't report it. So it wasn't. And all of that gaming becomes trivial and irrelevant in the current situation. And so in a sense, perhaps, Todd, we're just becoming more honest. Perhaps we're forced to be more honest with each other in these times. But
that strikes me as a really good way to look at that. I mean, that's a really interesting and very positive way to look at that.
I agree. And there's other ways in which I think a crisis like this tells us something about humanity and the indelible spirit of humanity that I think is hugely instructive. And I find it inspiring and encouraging, right? If you If you look at some of the hoarding and people pushing each other aside in the supermarket to get to the toilet paper, you go, wow, crisis is doing bad things to humanity, right? And it's sort of this Hobbesian, right, Thomas Hobbes interpretation of humanity, where if you strip away civilization, all that's left is a brute human being, barely better than the next animal, right? And but research actually returns a very different picture, and this came out initially during the Allied bombings of German cities and during the World War II, and what it showed was instead a crisis like this one, and of course, carpet bombing a city, quite literally, is a fundamental leveling device. And I mean, in bombing multiple ways, but even coronavirus is a fundamental leveling device because immunity doesn't exist. And you know what? It cannot be purchased because it isn't there. And so the virus is utterly agnostic about who you are, where you come from, how much cash you have, right? It doesn't care. And so it is, in that sense, to speak with Kierkegaard, existentially indifferent. It doesn't give a damn. And so that fundamental leveling does something to humanity because we're all in it together, right? And none of us is literally immune. And so what you see and what those studies in Germany showed was you get an immense generosity. You get people helping each other, throwing their skills out for others to use, their gifts, their talents, their time, their possessions, their assets. Everybody helps each other. And that generosity and literal selflessness is something that comes out during times of crisis like this one. And we're seeing it all across your country and, in fact, the world as we speak, which I think is immensely inspiring and encouraging. And what it tells me about all the work that we've done in safety over the past 2 decades shows that this consistent doubting and mistrusting humanity and the intentions of our fellow human beings, in which we've always felt that we need to put more rules and fences and limitations around our fellow human beings, lest they do the wrong thing, is misguided. We can actually trust our fellow human beings to do the right thing.
I can't imagine a better way to end a podcast than saying we can actually trust our fellow human beings to do the right thing. Maybe that's what I needed today, was a little boost of positive energy in the way I'm thinking about the world and the way the world's presenting itself to me. I really enjoyed chatting with Sid about this topic. I didn't think I wouldn't enjoy it. I mean, had I thought that would have been terrible, I probably wouldn't have done it. I mean, I'll just be really honest with you. But I didn't realize it would have this much value. And I would think about this problem so much differently than I thought about it before we had this conversation, which is why I'm so glad to share this with you. That's pretty much the podcast. I mean, think about it. Send this to your boss. See if you can get them to listen. Hopefully you can. That's good. All of you guys that listen, thank you. Take care of yourself, please. Give me comments or feedback. Do what you can. Get somebody else to listen. You know the drill. Until then, they'll learn something new every single day. I bet you did today. Have as much fun as you possibly can. Be kind to each other. And for goodness sakes, you guys, be safe.